at UCC. He's an EU law scholar, and his research focuses in particular in the area of EU external relations law. Impressively, as I was just saying, Dr. Lonardo has 2 books that are coming out at the end of this year. So the first one is entitled EU Common Foreign Policy After Lisbon, Between Law and Geopolitics. I believe it's being published by Springer. And the second one, which is the focus of today's seminar, it examines the EU's foreign policy reaction to the Russian war in Ukraine. Obviously, it's a conflict which is a watershed event in the sense that it's disrupted the post-Cold War security order, but it's also a watershed event for EU foreign policy in terms of the type of actions that have been adopted by the EU, and in terms of what it tells us about the EU as an international actor. So the book, to give it its full name, is entitled Russia's 2022 War Against Ukraine and the Foreign Policy Reaction of the EU, Context, Diplomacy and Law. And it's being published by Palgrave. So a very topical and a very important book. So in terms of this seminar, we'll follow a standard format. So Luigi will start with his presentation, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. So I'll leave it there, and I'll let Luigi take over.
Thank you, Billy. Should we record this?
Yes, Alistair, please record. There's my signal, which I forgot.
All right, already started.
Okay, so thank you, Billy, for the invitation. It is a pleasure to be invited. It is less of a pleasure to talk about the subject matter of the book, but I will share some slides that I have prepared for the occasion, just so that I can tell you a bit what was the rationale for writing this book, which is a very short monograph consisting of 3 chapters plus 1 introduction, which will be published by Palgrave next month, so in December. If there is one single key message that I want to share, and which I want there to be no ambiguity whatsoever, is the war must stop. I would try in the book to discuss many more themes, but I think that it is important to state it at the beginning, even though it might be obvious. So the rationale of writing the book is, okay, first, I thought I was in a position to synthesize and share scholarship that is interdisciplinary, and it involves Ukraine, Russia, and EU foreign policy. So in the book, I refer a bit to debates that exists in history, debates to which students of Russian studies or literature would be familiar with. But then I also discuss a bit of EU diplomacy and IR, EU security and defense, which is what I teach, and also EU law, which is the core of my research. Then I also thought that the book would be a good occasion to explore the complex causality behind the war, because there are issues of individual agency, collective agency, various levels of explanations that are being given, and we could discuss about individual psychology, collective psychology, history, geopolitics, culture, and so on. And finally, this book, more than as advancing one single original argument that contributes to the literature on the topic, is also a collection, inevitably so, of personal interpretations of my reflections on the war, because I found it incredibly hard to separate facts from my interpretation of those facts, even though I try to do that as best as I can. So I try to synthesize scholarship, and I try to comment on that by applying it to the events of the war. Now, essentially, I will try to tell you a bit about what I say in the book to give you a sense of the arguments, and I also have some quotations from the book itself, just to give you a sense of what it is that I actually say, and also of my style. So in the introduction, I put forward the two main arguments. The first is that the reaction of the European Union, so what the European Union has actually done, meaning intervening indirectly in favor of Ukraine and sanctioning Russia, was a choice shaped by two long existing constraints. On one hand, the EU is military dependent from the United States and NATO, and on the other hand, the EU was largely dependent for its energy supply from Russia. So this is the first key argument of the book. I am not saying that the EU would have done something different necessarily, so that the EU would have intervened militarily in favor of Ukraine and would have started a war against Russia if it had not been dependent on US militarily, so if it had its own army. I don't think I can say that for sure, but I can say for sure, and I refer to statements of ministers and the heads of governments, that the fact that the EU did not have an army and the fact that the EU had energy dependence on Russia did play an important role, a key role in the strategy. And the second key argument of the book is that, in fact, from my point of view, in my analysis, the reaction of the EU is not revolutionary in terms of the political and legal constitutional structures of the EU. And this is despite the rhetoric, despite the narrative that EU institutions give. So, for example, just to give you a sense of the kind of sentences that I have in the book, I try to show that the shocking moves of Putin, the man who decides Russian foreign policy, were motivated by desperate wishful thinking, by self-deception, and by adult interest, each contributing in proportions I am unable to determine. So here, I think I write these kind of things because I want to show that there is one person who is responsible for the ultimate decisions, and that is Putin. That if the leader of Russia had been a different person, the war might not have happened. And at the same time, why Putin has decided to do that is something that does not depend exclusively on him. It is partially due to the strategic interests of Russia, so the one they call here idle interest. It is partially due to cultural self-perception of Russia, of Russian and of Russians, and their role in Europe and in global politics, and that perhaps can be wishful thinking or perhaps is due to self-deception. Now, when it comes to the context, before I develop the two main arguments of the book, I set out a bit to discuss what are the salient features of the relationship between Russia, Ukraine, and the West. And I do that by referring to the public justifications that Putin has given for the war. Namely the fact that this is a necessary war for preventing the NATO expansion to the east, for protecting national security interests of Russia, and for protecting the Russian nationals who are in Ukraine and who are subject to genocide by the illegitimate government of Kiev. So I start by offering an introductory overview about the fact that Russia, throughout its history, has been obsessed with some key themes, such as geography, so its natural features, and multi-ethnicity. So Russia is a multi-ethnic country in which there are several ethnic groups, Russians being the hegemon within among the nations, but the constitution of Russia itself recognizes that there are several such nations. In the Soviet Union, this was even more obvious, and Ukrainians or Belarusians were some of the ethnic groups. And in terms of the obsession with geography, I note that this is something that has, to my mind, plays an important role in the way Russia perceives itself, because there is a Russian tradition of geopolitics that goes by the name of Eurasianism, which essentially maintains that since Russia doesn't have clear borders to the east or to the west, to the east, to the west of Russia and to the south, there isn't a clear natural frontier, then Russia is continuously exposed to enemies. And I try to systematize a bit these important themes that keep resurfacing in the Kremlin's rhetoric. And the way I systematize them is by considering two developments, two debates. The first is a debate that took place in 19th century Russia, and it is a debate between Slavophiles and Westernizers, or as I call them, Occidentalists. So very briefly, the Slavophiles were those who believed that Russia should not look at Western Europe in order to find its development. Western Europe at the time had gone through the Enlightenment. There was German philosophy, idealism, and then Romanticism. Slavophiles in Russia believed that Russia should forget about all that and find its own distinctive features in something else, in particular in the distinctive characteristics of the Russian civilizations, which are autocracy, nationhood, and orthodoxy. Now, Slavophiles therefore thought that Russia is somewhat special. Perhaps it's okay, to simplify a bit, it is special. It should not follow the same civilizational route of Western countries, and it should instead cultivate its own traditions and its own special cultures. Westernizers were the opposition, so to speak. Okay, and Slavophilism or Slavophilia became implicitly the official tradition, the official ideology of the Tsardom, especially in the second half of the 19th century. And then the truth is that in direct opposition to those Slavophile idea, the West began elaborating doctrines, strategic doctrines, to deal with Russia. And in particular, I am referring here to the doctrine of proto-containment, which is the doctrine. So the doctrine of containment is the doctrine that inspired directly the creation of NATO. It is a defensive doctrine that essentially wanted to prevent, so to contain the spread of communism to other countries neighboring the Soviet Union. Proto-containment is the embryonic form of the doctrine of containment. So it is, we could imagine, is the intellectual grandfather of NATO. And it was developed by Russian diplomats, by American diplomats who were posted in Russia in the 20s and in the 30s. These are all historical, these are objects of historiography, and they are relatively well-known facts. What I think is not studied sufficiently together is the fact that NATO is developed in direct contrast to certain assumptions. So in the book, I say that debate between Slavophiles and Westernizers pivoted around the great themes of Russian history and of the Ruski Mir, which is the Russian word, geography, orthodoxy, centralized state, and multi-ethnicity. So the chapter shows how Slavophile ideas on nationhood and geopolitics shaped Putin's thinking on identity and realpolitik, which are the two pillars of Russian foreign policy. And NATO developed more or less in direct contrast to the assumption on which Russian geopolitics is based. Okay. I then move on to diplomacy. I discuss some possible theoretical options. In theory, the EU could have said, now we're going to fight in favor of Russia, we're going to fight for Russia against Ukraine. They could have said, we're going to fight for Ukraine. What they settled for is a form of support for Ukraine, which is a form of indirect military support and coupled with sanctions against Russia. And in the next chapter, then I go into the details of what the European Union has actually done. So this chapter argues that the EU lacked a Russian strategy. So the doctrine of containment that I mentioned previously is the intellectual product of American diplomats. The European Union, to my mind, does not have such a thing. I analyze EU strategic documents. I find that they're wedded to a contingent vision rather than being more abstract and rooted in long-term developments. So, but I say Russia, the EU's implicit strategy is premised on enlargement rather than on containment. So on actively contesting the political control of certain countries, as if, such as Belarus and Ukraine, as if Belarus and Ukraine didn't have agency, didn't want to decide by themselves. And due to the two above-mentioned constraints, so energy dependence and military dependence, the EU had to choose an indirect confrontation with Russia. So I try to show how the EU's reaction is the result of all this context and constraint. And then in the chapter related to law, I say, okay, that of course legal issues are rendered almost irrelevant by the violence of the conflict. Okay, but at the same time, discussing law is still conceptually important, because on one hand, Putin keeps insisting that he is doing this because the West violates international law. So he is the one who puts law into the mix, who mentions law in his rhetoric. And in Putin's narrative, wherever the US or NATO fought wars, so whenever they intervened, it was without UN Security Council authorization, and therefore they bypassed the UN Security Council, the collective security system, the rules on which the international community had agreed after World War II. And by bypassing the UN Security Council, of course, they were bypassing Russia as well. And on the other hand, the EU's narrative is precisely the opposite. We, the European Union, the West, are the ones who actually follow rules, and Russia instead opposes a prestige-based or a power-based vision of international politics. So for the EU, international politics should be based on rules. For Russia, it should be based on power and military might. So for both actors, law is in fact a defining element of the international system. And I try to explain what are the issues of contentions, what are Russia's disappointment with the uses of law. They are the usual suspects: the 1999 NATO intervention in Kosovo, which was done without UN Security Council authorization because Russia would have never authorized it, the 2003 intervention in Iraq, again without explicit UN Security Council authorization, or at least it is very contentious. And then the 2011 intervention in Libya, which Medvedev, at the time was the president of Russia, abstained in the UN Security Council. So, so other states could intervene with UN Security Council authorization. And Syria, where Russia and the US could not have two more opposite positions, because both Russia and the US intervened. They intervened for the two opposing sides. And perhaps cynically, but Russia has always argued that its interventions in Ukraine were compliant with international law. I say interventions because there have been 3 of them. The first was the seizure of Crimea, even though it was not explicitly claimed by Russia then, in March 2014. Then Russia also intervened in the Donbass in 2014, and then there is the 2022 war against Ukraine, which Russia also tried to justify as a matter of international law by saying that it was acting in self-defense against NATO expansion, even though there was no imminent attack and there was even no threat of attack, no evidence that there would have ever been an attack, or that it was acting upon invitation of the independent Republic of Donetsk and Lugansk, which, however, only Russia recognized. So I think that it can be claimed to be a very artificial reasoning. But be that as it may, Russia did make an effort to justify as a matter of international law its action. Okay, and when it comes to what the EU has actually done as a matter of law, I think the most important topics to discuss are that the EU adopted its heaviest possible wave of sanctions against Russia and Belarus. It did so even before the conflict started on 23rd of February, so the day after Putin recognized the People's Republic of Donetsk and Lugansk in the Donbass. These sanctions are of several kinds. They try to asphyxiate the Russian economy in general. They in particular target the war-sustaining efforts, so the industries that enable Russia to finance a war, but they also try to isolate more generally the Russian economy by targeting banks and investments and so on. For the first time, the EU also censored Russian-sponsored media in the EU. This is the case of, for example, RT France or Sputnik. This was the first time that the EU has fought disinformation through sanctions. Then the EU also committed to providing humanitarian assistance by essentially easing the bureaucratic requirements for member states on admitting people in need for international protection. And the EU also provided financial assistance, and this is one of the key topics in which I think that there is a gap between the rhetoric of EU institutions and what the EU actually did. The financial assistance is for member states to gift weapons to Kiev. So sometimes I've read that von der Leyen or Josep Borrell stated that the EU is transferring legal weapons, but that is technically not correct. The EU finances member states so that the member states can transfer if they want, but there is no obligation for them to do so, so that they can transfer weapons. And as a matter of fact, it is the United Kingdom, so not a member state, the country in Europe which has provided the most financial assistance and military weapons to Ukraine. And in Europe, it is in the EU, it is Poland, the country that has provided most weapons. Finally, another important symbolic at this stage reaction of the EU is the start of the process of membership of Ukraine, which was done with the June 2022 European Council, where Ukraine and Moldova essentially were conferred the candidate status. So it is possible that these two countries might eventually join. Okay, so this essentially gives a very broad overview of the several themes that I try to touch upon in this introductory book. And I hope I have stimulated your interest, and I'd be very, very happy to discuss.
Thank you, Luigi, for that. That was a very interesting presentation, and I'm always impressed when someone manages to provide a summary of a monograph, and you've done that excellently. So thank you for that. So I can already open the floor for any questions. So if you have any questions for Luigi, you can raise your hands with the reactions function on the top of your screen. Or alternatively, what I can do is I'll ask a question and give the audience some time to formulate in their minds their own questions. So one question I have for you, Luigi, is that looking forward in terms of the EU's foreign policy. You mentioned the fact that the EU's policy with respect to Russia had been limited, that there were constraints to it. And in some ways, the EU is now catching up to that, right? So in the array of foreign policy measures that you mentioned, it's really quite unprecedented what the EU has done in response to this invasion. So I was wondering whether you had any thoughts in terms of what this tells us about the EU as an international actor, if this signals perhaps a shift that was perhaps already ongoing as the EU was increasingly positioning itself as a geopolitical actor. But I wonder if this event is maybe something that you see as potentially spurring it on.
Yeah, well, thanks. It also gives me the chance to expand a bit on some topics that I've only mentioned, but obviously couldn't say more on that. But think, for example, of how sanctions actually herald important policy shifts. The only one I mentioned en passant was the one on disinformation. So now the European Union, through sanctions, censors EU media because they spread the narrative of the enemy and not enough the narrative of the EU. So this is an important development, and one might wonder whether sanctions is the way to go about doing that, or whether some other piece of legislation should not instead be adopted to that effect. But another important shift is, and again through sanctions, the energy policy. So the sanctions of the European Union are meant to be temporary measures that are used to modify the behavior of a foreign actor with which the European Union disagrees. And they are used, can be used as leverage. Okay, they are coercive instrument. The sanctions of the EU in 2022 against Russia instead simply herald a shift toward the no dependence of Russia on Russia policy. So these sanctions essentially say we have no intention to use your gas either now or in the future. And it essentially is an important shift in EU geopolitics, okay, so in the uses of natural resources that the EU does, and they are done through sanctions. I don't know what is the leverage that the EU can use if the sanctions, rather than being temporary measures, are in fact heralding an important policy shift. And the third one also is more technical, also concerns criminal law, because the Council wanted to activate so-called Euro crimes, so crimes that are automatically of EU transborder relevance. whenever sanctions are violated. So there are these three areas: energy, disinformation, and criminal law, in which the sanctions are almost creating momentum that could spill over to other areas of EU integration. And to situate this, on one hand, one could say perhaps we need to think more carefully about this kind of constitutional changes that might be, in fact, implicit treaty amendments as far as the EU is concerned. On the other hand, it is difficult to see how an event that is so massive and so has, that is such a watershed. I begin the book by explaining why 24th of February is a watershed in European history. And it is therefore unsurprising that the EU, perhaps pushed by the United States, uses that as a catalyst, as a crisis to deepen integration, to take one step further in integration. Yeah, you're on mute.
I wonder if anyone wants to come in. Yep, for a few seconds. So we've got Clemens.
Let's see if this works. Hi, Luigi. I just had a, not sure, it's not a fully thought through question, but my thinking was around how external policy suddenly has an impact on the rule of law problem. If I think about Poland, because suddenly it seemed that Poland was no longer the ugly duck, and it's all kind of taken over by this. Oh, there's this foreign policy, and they're on the right side here. But von der Leyen was very, very quick to forget everything that was said before, as she usually is. So I'm kind of slightly worried about this enthusiasm about foreign policy suddenly undermines these deep and serious problems we have on the inside.
Yeah. So thanks, Clemens. So you use the word enthusiasm, which is one that I use several times in the book. I pay a lot of attention to emotions as drivers of policy, both in the EU and outside. But especially the EU rhetoric has been very emotional. It's possible that it is just rhetoric, so that the emotions were not actually there, but they were. But the policy reaction were phrased as such. And I think enthusiasm was one driver. I think there was also anger and indignation, but also perhaps fear. But be that as it may, the point you raise is, are we not forgetting the rule of law and so on? At the beginning, for sure, it seems like, yeah, now we have bigger problems than the rule of law. But in fact, conceptually, the rule of law, if taken seriously, is precisely what sets apart, so what the Ukrainians are fighting for. So it looks like now Ukraine wants to join the European Union. Perhaps earlier they were considering it. I don't know, but now they definitely want to. Okay, so Putin has achieved the opposite of what it wanted to achieve. It has definitely made sure that Ukraine orbitates very closely around the European Union. It has accelerated that choice, and it is fundamental to take very seriously the internal problems of the European Union. I sometimes also get a sense that the rule of law is a very Western European concept, at least in its genesis. The rule of law and l'état de droit exist because they existed in England, and then 200 years later they were formalized in France. And the further away you move from that core, from that axis, the less it becomes a key concern, or at least it is not defended as the ultimate value. To the point that EU foreign policy as well is explicitly predicated on conditionality for the rule of law. So in EU trade agreements or in the European neighborhood policy, the EU deals with other countries to the extent that those countries comply with the EU value of the rule of law. If it is correct to say that the rule of law is what sets apart an us and a them, where them is Russia, and I don't think it is correct, but if that is the rhetoric, then it becomes even more urgent to insist on the rule of law. By the way, Russia is also a state founded on the rule of law. It all depends. It all depends on how you interpret the terms and how it works in practice. Russia is a corrupt country, but it is formally based on the rule of law.
I think, Clemens, have you still got your hands up? Is that a second question or is just...
Sorry, just, I mean, if no one else, I don't want to take over the floor, but it is an interesting, I mean, it's interesting points you make, and on the point of rule of law, I think what is interesting looking forward, because you mentioned, you know, a possible accession of Ukraine. I think it would be interesting to see how the EU changes its enlargement process, because obviously that's not fit for purpose either. If you take that on, because I think at the moment there's a very, I'm not sure what the word would be, a very benevolent look at how the Ukraine functions as a democracy and what it wants. And so I think that there's a lot to be done, and it comes with a considerable risk, I think, for the EU itself. I mean, I would say, because, I mean, if I look, you know, there was a while back, there was an open letter by a few German intellectuals about the war, and they were critical about the current situation. I think that didn't go down well for them. So I think it is really difficult to be critical. I mean, maybe not now is not the time, but in the view itself, when it comes to enlargement, I think that's the next problem they will have. You know, how they adopt the process there. But thanks very much. It was a very, very interesting and stimulating talk for me. So thanks for that.
Yeah, thanks.
Does anyone else want to come in? Sec. So I actually have a follow-up question to what Clemens was discussing in terms of the link between this and the rule of law issue within the EU. And I was wondering, this is more a policy question, right? I was wondering whether this is an event which actually will help the EU address the issue in terms of its potential to loosen this alliance that you have between Poland and Hungary, whether this is maybe an event which will help the EU in addressing or solve, well, not solving it, but improving the rule of law issue in terms of loosening that alliance. Don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I just don't think that it is exclusively due to that alliance. So I'm not sure that loosening the alliance will automatically solve the issue or will help solving the issue. But for sure, we have seen that the Visegrad group, which at the beginning was united in condemning Russia, so Hungary go a different way. After, at the beginning of April, Orban won by a landslide the elections, and he, on the strength of his new term, then he made it hard for the EU, for example, to adopt sanctions related to Russian energy, and he's still criticizing very quite strongly sanctions, saying that sanctions of the EU against Russia is a dwarf who tries to punish a giant, and so on. So for sure, on that dossier, there has been there has been a policy. There is a shift. There is a divide between Poland and Hungary. On the other hand, it's also true that insofar as you have unanimity, which is the other big theme here, as long as you have unanimity for the imposition of sanctions, then Hungary can say whatever it wants. The move to and can defend, can veto, essentially, can defend its position and can veto the imposition of new sanctions. The move to a qualified majority voting for the adoption of sanctions might instead change things, because it would recognize that there are certain countries which are in a minority, and you could go ahead against the wishes of a sturdy minority. And that is the kind of themes that I discuss in the other book, because clearly, if you create a minority, then there is no need to have them on board at all costs. Okay. On the other hand, it's also true that this would need to change also for the procedure of Article 7 and the imposition of that kind of sanctions, because there instead unanimity of all the other member states is required, and until that changes, then they can Poland and Hungary can keep each other's back, so to speak. But I think that for sure the conceptual difference that the war makes is the European Union, or at least Europe in general, is a place where people want to go. I'm not saying it is a garden and the rest of the world is a jungle, but it is correct to say that, for at least for Ukraine, if the alternative is that, then it's a no-brainer. There are people who try to cross the sea to live in Europe, and the other great big issue that I haven't mentioned today is Belarus. That is sometimes forgotten in these discussions, but Belarus is officially close to Russia. It is also essentially military hostage to Russia at the moment because it has Russian armies on its territory, even though I get a sense that the population of Belarus is not going in that direction at all. So the fact that Putin has decided to trigger all these movements might show quite how important certain values can be, including the rule of law.
Right. Final call for questions, if there are any. Otherwise, what I'll do is, first of all, I'll thank the audience. Just so you know, Luigi, it's a mark of the interest that there was in this presentation and your book that we not only have academics here, but also non-academics. So which is quite unprecedented for one of these staff seminars. So there's lots of interest, and I'm sure they all enjoyed your presentation, which was excellent. So thank you very much for agreeing to give this presentation to us.
Thanks for having me.
And hopefully we'll see you very soon over here in Belfast. It's lovely weather all the time, I promise.
Fantastic. No, thank you all for being here and listening, and thanks, Billy, again for the invitation. It was very kind.
All right, take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.